talk all about 10 frames. First of all, what is a 10 frame? A 10 frame is a rectangle split into 10 little sections, 5 on top, 5 on the bottom, like this, 10 frames. So they're stacked on top of each other. And it is an amazing tool for students to start to make sense of numbers to 5, 10, or 20, depending on if you're using a 5 frame, a 10 frame, or a 20 frame. And they help kids make anchors to 5 and 10, which are super important numbers in our number system. And when they have a good concept of numbers to 5 and to 10, they can use those numbers to make sense of other numbers. So for example, if I said how many is 8, they might just have 8, but even just using your fingers, you can see that it's 5 and 3 more. So they can start to think about numbers that way. That can be helpful when you start working with bigger numbers and teen numbers. So they might see 8 on a 10 frame as 5 and 3 more. They might also see 8 on a 10 frame as 2 empty squares and the rest are full. So there's lots of different ways that kids can start to make sense of number when they have a tool that stays constant. If you just have them count 8 things, a lot of times they'll put them in a line. Sometimes the line is really long, sometimes it's really short, and it's not a structure that is consistent enough for them to start to make sense of what happens when it changes, because the variables of just lining things up change. And that's something that children will do a lot. If you ask them to count things, they'll just put them in one long line, but then they'll start to realize, especially when the numbers get bigger, that is not an efficient way to keep track of how many you're counting, because if you need to double check or you lose your number, you have to start over again versus grouping them. And so 10 frames can help kids start to group numbers into 10s, which are anchor numbers and easier for students to skip count. Now, when actually using a 10 frame in class, for example, again, if we'll stick with 8. If I said to student, show me 8 on your 10 frame, they might have, again, the 5 and 3 more or 2 empty spaces. But then when I ask them to change the number, like now I want you to make 4, there's lots of different strategies students will use to make a new number. Some students need to completely take off their 10 frame and start again from 1. Some students might just know that they can take off 4 to make 8. And while both are valid strategies, one might be more efficient than the other, but I can't emphasize enough, what is most important is that whatever strategy the kids are using, it makes sense to them. So I encourage you to highlight other strategies so students can see how other kids are working with these numbers, but the one that is the best is the one that's the best for them, the one that makes sense to them, because then they'll be able to apply that strategy to different situations. And with repeated exposure and being able to work with other students, they might see that someone else's strategy makes sense to them and is more efficient, and they will transition to that more efficient strategy. Something that I really love about 10 frames though is that they are so versatile. There are so many different games that you can play with a 10 frame. So if you're starting with warm-ups, the first thing you can do is quick images. So quick images is when you show an image on a 10 frame for this example, or 5 frame or 20 frame, really quick, show it to them for at most 5 seconds, more like 3, and then hide it. And the reason you're doing that is because you want them to start to subitize those numbers. That means being able to figure out what number they're looking at without counting it. So without counting it one by one, because then they'll start to recognize the number patterns in a 10 frame or 5 frame or 20 frame and be able to apply that to other things. So you show it really quick, hide it, and then ask them, what number did you see and how many did you see it? And there is a great opportunity for kids to tell you that they knew that 6 was 5 and 1 more, or 6 had 4 empty spaces on a 10 frame. If you're looking for number writing activities, because number writing can be something that is very repetitive, but they do need to practice. So we're always looking for ways to spice it up. So you might have heard of the traditional roll and write. They roll a normal 1 to 6 die and then write the number that they rolled. You can also do that with 10 frames. You can buy 10 frame dice on Amazon. I'll link some down below, but you can also make your own. Just find a dice template and put 5 frames on it, 10 frames on it, 20 frames on it, and then they can roll that dice and then still practicing numbers, but seeing it in a different representation. You can do the same thing with a spinner. Put 5 frames, 10 frames, 20 frames on a spinner and then spin and write instead of roll, and write. So the concept is the same. The game is familiar enough that students know how to play, but instead of a die, they have spinner. Instead of normal dice, they have 10 frame dice. So quick and easy ways to differentiate and spice up your stations without having to teach the kids something completely new. Another game I really enjoy is called Pick, Build, and Cover. So what a student will do is pick up a card, either a 1 to 5 frame card, 10 frame card, a 20 frame card, depending on the level that they're working on, and then they have to create that number, so recreate their 10 frame on a physical 10 frame, and then after that they're going to cover up the number that they got to see if they can cover all of their numbers. It's good for one-to-one correspondence. It is hands-on, and you can always spice that game up by changing the manipulative that they're using. So maybe one day you're using double-sided counters, the next day you're using mini erasers, the next day you're using cubes. Though be careful with cubes, because sometimes you want to build with the cubes instead of doing the actual game with the cubes, but sometimes just changing the manipulative that they're using can really spice up a game. So that is all about 10 frames and some 10 frame ideas that you can use in your classroom. I'll have the links to the blog post with everything written out down in the description box, as well as the 10 frame dice. And if any of these games that I talked about interested you, you can also find them down in the description.